Okay, now that we have ESXi installed, we can go ahead and from the console access what's called the DCUI interface. This is a replacement to the shell-only interface that we had in traditional ESX. That shell is still available if you want to use it, and if you're very Unix Linux savvy, you might feel right at home. But for most people who don't come from that kind of background, it's probably going to be easier to start with the DCUI. So I'm going to go ahead and press F2 where it says Customize System View Logs. And it's going to ask me for my root password. Now that I've gone ahead and logged in, I'm going to get presented with the menu-driven interface. In this case, I can configure the password for the root account. You may have a need to create other local accounts other than root. We can actually use Active Directory integration directly in ESXi, or we can do Active Directory integration via vCenter. That's generally going to be more appropriate. But if we want people to be able to log into the DCUI as something other than root, to do that, we're going to need to create user accounts for them, either using the shell or using the vSphere client. There's another section for the management network. When we went ahead and installed, it had to make some assumptions about how we were going to be operating on the network. And the primary assumption is that you've got a DHCP server out there that's going to provide us with an address. So you can see that in this case, I've picked up an address from my DHCP server, which is 10.82.1.1. and it's given me an address of 10.82.1.3. This virtual machine is bridged directly through VMware Workstation's networking functions to my network, and this is actually my Cisco router, which has provided an IP address. I've actually got multiple network interfaces associated with this virtual machine. I'm going to have some network interfaces which are connected to the outside world for virtual machines to communicate. Then I'm going to have other network interfaces which are isolated that I'm going to use for functions such as vMotion that don't need to go out onto my network, and from a security point of view, I don't want out on my regular network. So if I go into Configure Management Network, you'll see that I've got the option to list the various network adapters. Now I've got only one NIC currently being used for what's called the VM kernel network interfaces, or the VM kernel interfaces for this machine, or the default one that's created during the installation anyway. I actually have two NICs that are attached to the network, and if I've configured them to be attached to the same switch and that everything else is good, I can operate them as a network team. So I'll have one IP address associated with this VM kernel interface, which is really just a management virtual interface with an IP address that we can use to connect to. So we're going to associate that virtual IP address with one or more NICs using NIC teaming. Now this requires your switch to be configured to support NIC teaming, but this is quite common even on non-virtualized servers anyway. We'll talk more about that in the networking videos to come. For now, I'm going to go ahead and select VMNIC1 and add it there. My VMNIC2 and VMNIC3 are actually on a private VMware only network that's been created by VMware Workstation that I'm going to use later for things like iSCSI and vMotion. It can be difficult in a production environment if you have multiple network segments. Maybe you've got a DMZ network, or you've got a private management network, or you have multiple network segments of different security levels. You may have quite a large number of interfaces, and you want to balance that traffic across many interfaces. You could have quite a few listed here, and it can be a little difficult to tell which ones you really want unless you know exactly how they appear in terms of the numbering on the hardware or the actual MAC addresses associated with them. The easiest thing to do really is just attach the management network interfaces that you physically identify on the server. Just attach those, leave the others disconnected. That will be reflected here. It'll be much easier to ensure that you select the right ones, and then we can go ahead and configure them later for all the other functionality once we start doing that using the client. Now, because of inactivity, you can see that the screen's gone kind of dim here. That's fine. As soon as I hit a key, it's going to light right back up. So I've got VMNIC0, VMNIC1 selected. If I press D to view details, you'll see it adds a little bit more information. We've got this used by vSwitch 0. We're going to talk more about vSwitches and VM kernel interfaces and port groups and other network related concepts a little bit later on. Since this is a new install, the only vSwitch we're going to have is vSwitch 0. So it doesn't really tell us a huge amount, but later on, if we had multiple virtual networks created with multiple virtual switches, this would be able to help us identify the correct ones later on. I'm just going to go ahead and say OK here. Now that I've done that, you can see that we have a VLAN section. If I'm using what's called VLAN tagging, I'm going to need to provide the VLAN ID that I want the management interfaces anyway of this server to communicate on. I'm not doing that here, so I'm going to leave that blank. But otherwise, it would just be a simple VLAN ID number. This requires trunking to be configured with your switches, and we're going to discuss this more in the networking videos to come. So I'll just cancel out of here. If I go into IP configuration, I can change. I can either continue using a dynamic IP address, or I can set a static IP address here quite easily. Remember, even though I've selected two network interfaces, they're not going to operate as two different network interfaces. They're going to be linked in a team. So they're going to have the same TCP/IP configuration. They're also going to have the same VLAN configuration and the same vSwitch configuration. If, for example, we have management occurring on multiple networks, we can define additional VM kernel IP addresses later. Here we can only have one. I'm just going to go ahead and change it here to .250. And my subnet mask is fine, my default gateway is fine, and there's actually really no other options. So I'm just going to say OK. For entering other details such as DNS, we can come down here to DNS configuration, and I can provide my local DNS server, which I haven't configured yet. I'm going to install Active Directory in a Windows virtual machine a little bit later on. I'm going to prepare that for installing a management server, particularly a vCenter machine, and also somewhere where we can run the client. So I'm going to change the host name here to ESX-01. I can add additional suffixes here. You can see my local internet provider. I'm going to remove that and call it VMwareLab.local and then enter. And at this point, I'm just going to hit escape to go back, and it says you've made changes to the management configuration. So I'm going to go ahead and restart the management services, or at least I'm going to need to restart the network services. Is that okay? Typically, this won't have too much impact. They say it may result in a brief network outage. That's generally not going to happen, but there are a couple of scenarios where it could. So it's always a good idea to test it on your lab environment before you do it in production for the first time. I'm just going to go ahead and say yes. You'll notice I actually can restart the management network from here directly. That's generally not necessary, but one thing you will see is that it does force a renew of a DHCP lease. If you've ever done the standard Windows IP config release renew, this is somewhat of that type of functionality. I'm skeptical that anyone's going to run their ESXi servers using DHCP anyway, so I don't think that's too serious. You can do a test management network here, and that will go ping your gateway. It'll also ping your DNS servers, and it will try to resolve itself. It does not dynamically register in DNS the way Windows clients do, for example. There are some network restore options if you really get things wrong here, or if you start moving to what are called distributed vSwitches rather than standard vSwitches, and you create a situation where you can't connect remotely, then you can go ahead and restore it here back to the defaults effectively and start again. So I don't really need to do that, but you can see that I can restore the network settings, or I can go back and switch to the original standard switches or switch back to the distributed switches if necessary. The troubleshooting options are fairly interesting. As I was saying, we have a Linux style shell, what we call the ESXi shell, available, so we can enable that from here. We can also enable remote access to that shell through SSH, and there's also the feature to restart the management agents, which is a little bit like restarting the management network, but when you restart the management network, you're really reinitializing all the network interfaces. When you restart the management agents, you're really restarting the VPXD service, which is used to respond to vCenter. So if you're not using vCenter, if you're just using the free version of ESXi, that won't affect you, but you will see sometimes that in the client, when it's connected to vCenter, that you'll have servers that say they're not responding. What it often means is that it's actually the agents that are not responding, the service that's not responding. In old ESX, we could go into the shell and restart those services manually, but it's much easier to do that here, especially if you're not that familiar with how to restart services in a Linux style environment. I mentioned earlier, when you're at the console, you can use Alt F12 to see the logs, but if you go into the view system logs here, you'll see there's multiple log files available. We can view the system log, which is what we would have gotten off of Alt F12. We can also go in and view the VM kernel log. We've got the configuration log, the management agent logs, as well as the virtual center agent, which are pretty closely tied to each other. And we've also got the VMware ESXi observation log, which doesn't have too much interesting detail in it, more of changes to the state. Not necessarily going to tell you that something is broken, but may tell us, for example, that we've lost connectivity over a network connection. Inside these log viewers, you'll see we can actually use a little bit more functionality than what we have on just the Alt F12 log viewer. So if I go into the help here, you can see that it's much more detailed, and we can actually use a pretty powerful search environment here. We've also got navigation keys, which are fairly familiar to you if you are a Linux, Unix-oriented person. And if we take away the view support information, there's not a huge amount here, but we can see some of the key fingerprints that are used for SSH communication. We can also see the thumbprint associated with the SSL certificate. By default, both ESX traditionally and now ESXi will create a self-signed SSL certificate, which, if you're not overly concerned about security, is perfectly fine and works well for most environments, but there's a risk that we're being spoofed, for example, and that the self-signed certificate you get presented was self-signed by someone other than your VMware server. The appropriate way to handle this is to generate proper SSL certificates and then install them into your VMware servers. Once you start doing that, if you run into any difficulty with having the right version of the certificate installed or anything like that, it can help us to troubleshoot a little bit here by having this available to us. But you might not ever really end up having to deal with this. And it doesn't really give us that much in terms of support information. They say press page down for more, but as you can see, there's actually nothing really on this second page. If you press page down, you'll see some information such as your vendor service tag and asset tag if it's available from the BIOS, and a few other BIOS details, and the onboard management controller if you have one. This may be somewhat useful in diagnosing problems, but probably we're more likely to have to consult those logs and provide those logs over to VMware Tech Support or just go in and access them ourselves. We can view them from here, but we can't copy them off of the system. If you really cause a problem on your system and you want to reset the system configuration, potentially you can do that just by doing reset system config. In the next video, we're going to take a look at enabling the shell and go on a tour of what we can see in the Linux type environment that gives us more access to the raw functionality of ESXi.